Well, welcome to PAGI, the Plastics Awareness Global Initiative. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Igor Kornichuk, a board member representing the newly founded family philanthropic organization, Wilsdorf-Mettler Future Foundation. This is our foundation's first big exposure, and we hope that with PAGI, this collaboration and synergy continues wherever the road takes us. These next 4 days here hosted at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, which starting just a few hours ago, are a series of workshop roundtables and global experts assembled here to address this very concerning issue of plastic choking the planet. And it includes 2 public plenary and presentation sessions. This is the first. Tomorrow night, the public events continue with further presentations from a number of field-active NGOs and scientists. Same place, same time. Here then, I want to introduce to you Dr. Stuart Sandin, a most well-known ecologist and marine biologist, recognized worldwide in his field with a doctorate from Princeton, working here at Scripps as research and teaching professor for nearly 15 years, much beloved by his students and peers, a published scientist and compelling lecturer and innovator who is specifically, pixel by pixel, putting the ocean floor on the map for mankind with his 100 Island Challenge, and who has just recently was appointed as director of the Center for Marine Biodiversity Conservation. Our 2 paths crossed, literally, in the open waters of the Pacific. I'm so proud and pleased to introduce to you the lead director of PAGI, Dr. Stuart Sandin.
Thank you, Igor. And thank you, everybody, for showing up tonight. This has been a long time in the making, and it's really just a pleasure to see so many faces in the room as we kick off PAGI, the Plastics Awareness Global Initiative. This is our Ocean Sciences meeting, and as you may imagine, that's our goal, is to learn something about the science that's underlying the problem that I think we can all share, or at least all agree upon, is linked to people, which is people-made products in the ocean. Well, let me first give you a brief introduction to Scripps Institution of Oceanography's Center for Marine Biodiversity and Conservation. Beyond being a center that has many more syllables than it should have, it is our working organization to try to provide a public face, a set of access to the science that goes on at Scripps. A lot of our science at Scripps has had global impact. And I can't mention that without looking over at Professor Walter Munk and think of the illustrious career and impact that he's had through the decades. And it's always a pleasure to have you in attendance, Walter. Thank you for being here. CMBC follows from a vision that's been built by Professor Munk and his colleagues, this idea that science isn't just for us to be doing today, but science is for all of us, and to have access to that science is to have real impact. Our currency is to generate science and to publish peer-reviewed papers. That's where the ivory tower idea comes from. Put it all in the canons of the library and store it in dusty books or now digital archives for time immemorial. And I can tell you that time immemorial is one of the most valuable resources we have on the planet. Science getting collected, conducted, and archived. But a lot of issues on this planet today require that we not only archive the science, but we use it. And use it today. And in many cases, use it yesterday. The thought is, we have issues that we know that we care about. We as a society can agree that we would like to live in a different reality, and those solutions take good science. Scripps is a platform, a location, an institution built to gain that knowledge and then to transmit that knowledge. Our center, we're really proud to have this opportunity to host PAGI Ocean Sciences, this workshop and initiative that you'll hear more about today. But this isn't the end of CMBC's activities. CMBC is really trying to take the interest of our community our scientific peers, and our colleagues across the globe, and to make sure that the science is translated and available. This is one of those forms of translation that we're hoping is something that becomes a regular rather than a rarity here in the Scripps Forum. I also want to, so on this topic today, we're really excited to treat the issue of marine plastics. Well, excited is probably the wrong word. To at least have a forum to discuss it. I think that I've been probably personally most impressed by the idea of marine plastics and the societal response that's been coming up around it. How many people would have thought a year ago that we'd be hearing about global, or at least regional, national, and global campaigns to ban single-use straws, et cetera? We have the University of California committing to a zero waste stream by the year 2020 right now. The dining services here on the UC San Diego campus have already banned all straws, call it a good step. And they're making plans to take all of our catering and to move it to reusable rather than disposable. You'll see tonight in the reception that follows, we're helping to push that. Yes, currently it costs a little bit more, but if we all do the right thing, we're going to flip things over, and that's the way that we want the world to be. I want to celebrate the University of California for making these moves that really are trying to think about tomorrow and not just respond to small economic hurdles. We can solve these in a way that's economically viable as well. Okay, I again want to thank you, but I want to move the program over to where it belongs. It's probably my personal treat with this workshop has been the opportunity to work with one of our newest faculty here at Scripps Institution of Oceanography, Dr. Anela Choi. Dr. Choi is coming to us from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, where she's been working on food web processes in the open ocean, thinking about flow, flux, movement of energy, nutrients across different organisms in the ocean. And lo and behold, what did she notice? That food wasn't just food anymore. It was things that we were feeding it, and that what we were feeding it were man-made plastics. She's going to be serving as the moderator today for this workshop. She's also going to be serving as one of the leads for one of the 3 focal groups in the days ahead. With this, I want to introduce Dr. Anela Choi, and thank you for taking the time to organize this entire campaign for us tonight.
Thanks for that introduction, Stuart. I'm really happy to be here tonight and see you guys all here eager to learn about plastic pollution from some of the world's most eminent experts on the topic. As you've all heard, over the next few days, there's about 30 of us scientists from around the world who've come together to synthesize the state of the problem centered on 3 different topics. So our 3 plenaries tonight are going to be centered around those 3 topics, and I'll introduce you to the topics and the speakers one at a time. So I wanted to point out that everyone who is working on the workshops is here tonight, and we all have these name tags on. So they're going to stick around after our formal program is done, and I encourage you to interact with them, meet them, ask them what they do, ask them questions. This is your chance to interact with the scientists firsthand. So the 3 problems that we'll be reviewing, digesting, and synthesizing are really exercise in trying to understand where we are with the state of the science and where do we need to go to make meaningful change. So we bring you 3 different plenary speakers who will introduce you to the science framing these 3 different topics. And then when we're finished, we're going to hold off on questions, and we're going to bring up 3 additional scientists, form a panel up here in the front, and that's when we'll open up to questions from the audience. So the first topic is one that's very close to us all. It highlights the scope and the scale of plastics in the ocean alongside animals that live in the ocean. And that's in Earth's largest habitat, the open ocean. So we want to know, what is the overlap of plastic pollution with animals that live in the ocean? And how might human societies who rely on the ocean for sustenance and commerce be ultimately impacted? So I'm really pleased to introduce you to our first plenary speaker, Dr. Bryce Simmons. Dr. Simmons is a professor here at Scripps. He's also the director of the California Cooperative Oceanic Fisheries Investigations, or CalCOFI. Professor Simmons is a quantitative fisheries scientist and a statistical ecologist. His impressive body of work has shaped the conservation of fishery populations worldwide. He'll be introducing you to the framework of assessing life in the dynamic ocean. So please welcome Dr. Simmons.
Okay, hi everybody. Can we dim the lights a little bit, or is that not possible? No response. That's cool. So I just came from another meeting, and at that meeting, for their snack, we had individually wrapped in plastic brownie bites, and it made me realize that even in the hallowed halls of our scientific institutions, sometimes meetings and people can be a little bit tone deaf. As Anela pointed out, I am a fisheries scientist, and I don't have a lot of expertise, or at least I didn't up until a couple of days ago, expertise in the world of plastics, but actually that was really great. It was really great for me because I got to take a deep dive into the current literature on the subject and start to formulate a talk that really describes the scope and scale of the problem of plastics in the ocean. And what I think is really neat is that while I am not necessarily an expert in this topic, we have a bunch of experts in the room and are participating in this workshop. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited to interact with these folks, many of whom I'm going to be citing throughout the course of this talk. And also they get to correct me when I say things that are incorrect. So with that in mind, we'll start by talking about, in terms of scope and scale, production of plastics. So it really wasn't until the early 1950s that plastics became a commercial product. And within short order, the ramp up in terms of production of plastics was really on an exponential trajectory. And so this is a graph that goes through the late 2000s to the 2010s, really right at the point at which the economic downturn happened. And so except for basically a monotonic increase in production, you see that really little tick at the very end, and that was during the Great Recession that happened recently. And if we actually carry that out into more recent times, that upward swing continues its inexorable trajectory. So in recent times, we're at about 300 million tons of plastic production per year globally. A lot of that has to do with packaging. Roughly 40% of all the plastics that we produce is packaging, whether or not that's individually wrapped brownie bites or it's water bottles that we're drinking and getting served at our meetings here. So lots and lots of plastic. Of that, roughly 300 million tons per year, 4 to 12 million tons of that enters our ocean every year. So 1.5 to 4.5% of global production somehow or other ends its way up into the ocean. And that number or amount of plastic that's ending up in the ocean is expected to double in the next decade. So there's no slowdown in plastic production, and there's no slowdown in terms of that plastic entering the ocean in terms of an increasing trajectory. What's really interesting, though, is we don't know where 99% of that plastic goes once it goes into the ocean. We have some indication of where plastics is, and we're going to be talking a lot throughout this workshop, and I'll be talking a lot today about large plastic and microplastics and maybe even nanoplastics. But the fact of the matter is, a lot of the plastic that hits the ocean, we don't know where it ends up yet, and so that's a big part of ongoing research, is to try and figure out what the fate is of plastic that enters the ocean. But in the end, you see something like this, right? So we think about global problems and we zoom in on the actual inputs of plastics to the ocean, and it might look something like this. So here's a river output from Haiti in the Caribbean, and there's a huge exodus of plastic, particularly after large rains. And so what happens to this plastic once it ultimately hits the ocean? What is the fate of that plastic? And what can we say about that input of plastic into the ocean? And we have a general sense of this, which is that at some point the plastics come out into the river or the nearshore coastal environment, and they get broken up both by solar irradiation as well as mechanical mixing in the nearshore waters. Some of that plastic, especially the heavier plastics like PVC, immediately sinks and goes to the bottom, but the remainder floats and continues to break up as it moves out into the open ocean. There's interactions with animals along the way at times in terms of both eating the plastics and also creating habitats for the animals as well. At some point, that plastic that's still floating is in the gyre and continues to break up. Some portion of that might sink. and hit the sediment, and at that point that plastic could become part of the food chain in the sediment, or might actually be put back up into the water column through bioturbation. So that's kind of the general, as we understand it, the general process of plastics, but we tend to think about plastics in terms of the great garbage patch, right? We think about this area, as they always say, the size of Texas, which I think in a lot of people's minds is something that you could literally just get off a boat and walk across, right? And it's not like that, but it certainly is a larger concentration of plastic in these certain areas. And these areas that happen around the globe, they're driven by oceanic processes. So we have areas of persistent high pressure at certain parts along our oceans, and those areas of high pressure cause winds or air to move up and down depending on whether or not you're on the north side of that area of persistent high pressure. And through Coriolis forces, that creates trade winds. Right? Trade winds, winds that move either east or west in a persistent manner. And those winds in turn drive surface currents. And in areas where you have these centroids of high pressure zones that are persistent, you get these gyres or surface-driven currents that end up basically in large eddies. And those things, over time, accrue more and more plastic. They're centers of aggregation of plastics. And so there's really 5 major gyres that exist out there. And one of those is off our west coast here in California, and that's where that great northern Pacific garbage patch exists. And so these are the 5 gyres, and each one of those is associated with larger concentrations of plastics in the ocean. And we can actually model this, right? So we can take what we know about the oceanography and wind-driven surface currents, and we can place particles in a virtual world, and we can simulate them forward for 10 years and see where they end up. And predictably, we would say, based on modeling exercises, that the vast majority of the plastic particles we simulate end up in these gyres, or in these large eddies, including right here. And of course, that's our giant Pacific garbage patch that you can't walk across. But it's still, there's a lot of plastic there, right? Okay. And in fact, if we overlay recent oceanic expeditions to go out and actually sample with nets, either bongo nets or manta toes, the same types of nets we might use to collect zooplankton and ichthyoplankton, we can use those same nets to sample plastics, and it turns out that, yes, in these major areas of aggregation of coastal or surface wind-driven conditions, you get also larger concentrations of plastics. All right. In our neck of the woods, we have CalCoffee, which is the California Cooperative Oceanic Fisheries Investigations, and it is a coastal observing ship-based program that's been happening since 1947. And CalCoffee is unique in that both its scope is larger than any ocean observing program that's continuous for 70 years, but it also is a physical sample-based program. So they actually take out with ships nets, and they go and collect zooplankton, ichthyoplankton, along with other environmental data, physical data like pH and oxygen, carbonate system. And this is great because it tells us something about the distribution and abundance of nearshore animals, and it's not really nearshore. They're going out 500 kilometers or more in these stations. But the other thing, too, is because we have preserved samples of what these nets collected way back to 1947, we have the makings of a sample of microplastics for the last 70 years across our entire West Coast and in more contemporary contexts across most of California. Okay, and so some preliminary analysis have been done using that data, and it turns out that if you look at samples from 1984, 1994, and 2007, the two things are apparent, I think, are interesting. The majority of our CalCoffee stations, or those locations using the ship where we stop and sample, have plastics. What's really interesting, though, is if you go back 30 years into the 1980s, they still had plastics, and there is no significant difference in the amount of stations that had plastics compared to those 3 different regions of time. So plastics, even though we really only started having major production of plastics in the 50s, already by 84, you had microplastics in most of the samples. And this is the scratching the surface, right? What's really interesting to me, and we haven't done it yet, is to go back and look at the spatial distribution and abundance of samples in the CalCoffee data across the entire time set. And if we do that, we actually have arguably the single largest, most comprehensive sampling of plastics anywhere in the entire world, right here. All we've got to do is do the hard work of processing the samples. Okay, and this is just to point out that that's when Cal Coffee started, right? So we literally encompass the entire time that plastics were created. So it's a unique data set. Other examples of sampling that have taken, this is an oceanographic survey that went out specifically to go survey the garbage patch and used a series of different sampling techniques. The key takeaway here is that these are the estimates of the particle concentrations of different sampling stations that they hit, and the M's here stand for manitoes and the B's stand for bongo nets. Those are just different sampling types. What I want you to notice is the y-axis is on the log scale. There are massive differences in the number of concentrations or the concentration of plastics in the different samples. So variability in the plastics in the ocean is huge, huge, and that's a real challenge for us. Because if we want to say something about the change in the relative abundance of microplastics through time, gosh, we're going to have to do a lot of sampling in a very strategic way in order to have the resolution, in order to monitor and measure what that change looks like through time. What's really interesting too about this particular study is that they demonstrated quite convincingly that there wasn't a very direct correlation between the amount of microplastics underneath the surface and the amount of macroplastics at the surface. So those pieces of plastics that were large enough for people to see with binoculars from a ship. So the correlation between those two things is low and the variability in microplastics is high. What that really means is one of the things we need to be very concerned with is how we survey the world if we hope to be able to characterize the change in plastic through time. Nonetheless, there are surveys that have demonstrated really convincingly that there have been major changes in the amount of microplastics through time. So this study looked at, in the 1970s, of the two graphs estimating the density of microplastics, and then again in the 2010s on the right, those two. And what you'll see is that there's a 2 order of magnitude difference in the density of microplastics between those 2 decades. The difference between this study and the Cal Coffee study, this survey was done inside those centers of aggregation, inside the place where plastics accrue. Right? In Cal Coffee, we're in the transition zone. We're in the place where plastics move away from. They ultimately aggregate in those gyres, not along our California coast. And so these are the sorts of things in a global context we need to consider if we're hoping to monitor changes in the density of plastic through time. Whereas Cal Coffee might provide a rate, something like monitoring the gyre might tell you a total abundance or a density. If we think about plastics in the context of ecosystem impacts, biological impacts, we tend to have conversations about how microplastics might accrue. We know that microplastics end up in lots and lots of different organisms' stomachs, and it stands to reason that if one organism eats another organism and something else eats that, in terms of a trophic food chain, that you would expect some version of biomagnification of plastics in the stomachs of those animals that are eating other animals that have eaten plastic. Turns out, though, that there's not a great deal of evidence to suggest that that is actually true, or at least it hasn't been well demonstrated yet. So we think also of maybe impacts associated with chemicals associated with microplastics impacting the health of the organisms that we eat, or in turn impacting our health as humans that rely on seafood to a greater or lesser extent. Again, there is not a huge amount of evidence that that actually takes place. So if you think about the chemicals that are actually used to make plastics, and we've all heard about BPA, right? So BPA is it's probably the single greatest globally regulated chemical. It's a synthetic estrogen, also is nonylphenol, NP. Both those chemicals that are commonly used in plastics production are synthetic estrogens. They're known to at high concentrations, cause birth defects, and they have lots of nasty things happening when you have a lot of them in your system. So the question is whether or not when we eat plastics that have those things, or when something eats plastic that has those things, do those nasty chemicals transfer into the bloodstream, into the biological system? And so people have tried this in several different instances where they've actually gone ahead and fed plastic to things and measured the concentrations of these things in the biological system, whether or not they're feeding lobsters or fish. And guess what? There's really not a lot of evidence to suggest that that transfer happens in any real sense. Very, very small. Very small. The other thing that might be happening is that POPs, or persistent organic pollutants. These plastic pieces, when they're floating around, especially as they get smaller, they become essentially little sponges where they pick up organic pollutants that are in the environment existing. So you get plastic pollutants, or these little plastic pellets, and they serve as aggregating devices for things like PCBs. And of course, PCBs are not good, right? Lots of reasons why we don't want to consume PCBs. And so you can take those plastic pellets that are loaded with PCBs and you can feed them to things like lobsters. And then you can look at the extent to which PCBs transfer into lobster flesh. Turns out it really doesn't. It really doesn't. So there is a lot of concern about the chemical impacts of plastics. And I'm not saying it doesn't exist. I'm saying we haven't found it yet, or at least not clearly. And again, other people that are a lot more intelligent than I can correct me on this, but my dive into the literature over the last couple days seems to suggest to me that there's not a lot of evidence that the chemical impacts associated with ingestion of plastic are huge. And the other thing that, of course, I'll point out is there's very little evidence or research that's been done to look at the exposure of microplastics in the marine environment relative to other parts of our world, whether or not we're dealing with makeup or hairspray or any of the other things that have plastics associated with it. And in fact, there's a huge line of medical research right now looking at nanoplastics as vehicles for delivery of drugs. Actually giving you as a medicine nanoplastics that are loaded with drugs, because we know predictably how they move from the gut system into the bloodstream and then accrue in certain organisms, certain parts of your body. So there's the other side of the medical world that's actually looking at the possibility of using nanoplastics as vehicles for delivering drugs to us. All right, so what we do know is that microplastics have lots of other really bad things. They result in lots of bad things, at least what we consider to be bad things. One of those is of course, stowaways. So they essentially create forms of habitat that allow organisms from big to small in order to attach and raft and get themselves to places where they don't currently exist. So we've talked about these gyres, and here's a paper that looked at the impact of bringing invasive species from debris that came from the tsunami that hit Japan. And we talked about gyres as accruing those pieces of plastic and floating flotsam, but of course they don't all go into those gyres, and some of those things break off those gyres from time to time, and they end up over here on the west coast. And so we see large rafted pieces of plastic, or docks, for instance, that showed up on Oregon coast and brought up a diversity of different demersal species, sessile species, but also even fishes. They found knife jaws, which is a kind of fish that you don't find on this coast, but you'll find it over in the Asian Pacific. So as we get more and more of these things in the environment floating around, it provides more and more habitat that allows transport of things to different ecosystems and habitats that they weren't naturally existing within. And of course, probably the most visual impacts from the plastics that we see is through ingestion and entanglement. So there's been tons of work done on ingestion, and of course, you've probably all seen these pictures, right? Which are just disturbing to say the least. Many different seabirds are impacted by ingestion of plastic. This is from a study by Wilcox fairly recently in Proceedings of National Academy, showing that there's been an increase through time in the proportion, for particular studies, in the proportion of birds that had plastic in their guts. And again, through time, the number and amount of plastic ingestion in individual birds within studies. And then finally, if you look at the accumulation of known species of seabirds that have interactions in terms of ingestion of plastic, this is that curve right now. So if you look at this graph right here, this is the amount of species affected by ocean plastics as a function of space along the map. And what you'll notice is that map does not look like the distribution of plastics in the ocean. Right? You don't see the gyre. What you see is that is the global richness of birds. In other words, if you are an ocean bird, you're impacted by plastic, no matter where you are. And because of that, the number of birds impacted by plastic as a function of space is simply a function of the diversity of birds in that region. So it's absolutely pervasive. In terms of entanglement and ingestion, so Wilcox also did a study, this was published in Marine Policy, where they solicited expert advice by people that do plastics for a living, and they asked them to kind of rank relative risks of plastic in the marine environment to the biology of the marine environment. And the thing that really cropped up as the most important is ingestion and entanglement, poses threats to marine fauna, fishing gear and balloons in terms of entanglements and threats, and then plastic bags and utensils in terms of ingestion. So the direct impacts of interactions of large organisms and small organisms and the plastics themselves is really probably one of the biggest impacts of oceanic plastic. Okay, and then I'll end with this, which is that we as scientists, we tend to go out and study the world and think about, okay, what's the impact on our trophic ecology? What's the impact on our ecosystem? Let's get into the weeds and look at the chemical impacts on our biological processes within our body. But the reality is that in most of our society, this is what people are most concerned with. This is the impact to them. This is their economic impact, which is they're hoping to have a pristine, clean experience on the ocean, and they don't. They can't. Oftentimes because it's hard to find a place in this world that doesn't have plastic impacts associated with it. And Lord help you if you find yourself on a windward side of an island in the Caribbean, because it's just going to be coated with flip-flops, my friends, all over the place. And so this is a real impact. It may not be biological, it may not be ecological, but it's a societal impact and something that needs to be addressed just as much as those other impacts. All right, thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Bryce. The second topic we'll be addressing this week centers on the long, complex life cycle of plastic in the ocean. Ultimately, as you heard from Bryce, plastic is produced on land in vast industrial quantities. What happens when it enters the ocean? How does it get there? How much has been transported? Not only must we consider the diversity of land-based sources, but also the transport pathways that move plastic around within the ocean. So to orient us to the complexity of the problem, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Jenna Jambek as our second plenary speaker. Dr. Jambek is a professor in the College of Engineering at the University of Georgia. She's also a National Geographic explorer, and her work on plastic waste inputs into the ocean has been widely recognized and translated into policy discussions. So let's please welcome Professor Jambek.
Thank you so much. It's really great to be here. The ocean outside our door and with amazing scientists and oceanographers. I'm here, but I'm kind of a fish out of water, pun intended. I'm an environmental engineer. I'm much more at home tromping through a landfill, sorting trash, and honestly meeting the people on the front lines of managing our waste around the world. So in my capacity of working in solid waste management for over 20 years, I've been able to travel all over, meet those people, probably been in about 15 countries or so in the last 16 months. But today, I want to talk about the intersection of the folks here, so oceanographers, scientists, marine scientists, and the work that I do on land. So that results in marine debris or plastic in our ocean that we know of. And in many cases, we've seen pictures of it floating in the ocean and on the coastline, but also we know it's in our riverways, in our lakes. So this top picture is actually one of our Great Lakes in the US. And then when we talk about mismanaged waste, I want this bottom picture on the right to come into your head. So I did a beach cleanup recently somewhere and turned around, and this was what was on the other side of the parking lot. So we left a pristine beach, and then the other side of the parking lot was a bunch of trash as well. So you heard a little bit, and that was great that Bryce gave a good introduction on the increase in plastic over time. We also were able to publish a paper sort of quantifying all of the plastic ever made. So it was started to record in 1950, and we know that by 2017 we had created over 8 billion metric tons. So all of those annual inputs over time, that's also equal to 80 blue whales. 80 million, sorry, 80 million blue whales. So hard numbers to imagine, right? So, and because you saw that he had a pie chart on there, it was about almost 40% of this plastic is used for packaging or single-use items. That means that already over 6 billion metric tons has entered our waste stream. So that's a large quantity of plastic to have to manage. So those of us working in solid waste management, it became quite overwhelming to manage this new material entering our waste stream. So what have we done with it? Well, we've only recycled 9%. So if we're thinking that recycling is going to be the answer to this, we have a long way to go. Also, really the only way it disappears is through thermal treatment. We have incinerated about 12% of it, but that means that almost 80% of it is either in our landfills or somewhere else on our land today. And all projections going forward is that this is supposed to increase. So certainly catching up, I would say, with this issue and then getting ahead of it, to continue to try to get ahead of it is important. So I'm sort of covering this area where thinking of how plastic gets to the ocean and where it does come from. So plastic itself is a resin pellet, sort of in its most raw form. This is how it's transported around the world. It looks like these small pellets up at top. We know that some of those in their raw form are lost to the environment and can make it to the ocean. If you are somewhere where you see microplastic washing up on the shore, oftentimes you'll see some of these small pellets as well. And then we know it gets made into plastic products that we use every day. I don't think we can imagine our lives without plastic. The chairs we're sitting on, much of the furniture, our electronics, advances in the medical industry. I mean, it's totally a part of our life right now. And so what we're often talking about, though, as mismanaged is these single-use items, and much of it packaging. And so this is what that looks like when it can end up in our environment and then end up in the ocean. And then we also have microscopic items in the first place. So they're entering our environment at this microscopic level, so smaller than a pencil eraser. In this case, with microbeads, they're more like the tip of a pencil, and then microfibers. And those are ending up in our waterways from our wastewater treatment systems. And then we have some maritime sources. So we know that lost and derelict fishing gear is also a source of plastic that can enter our ocean, and a very deadly source at that because it's designed to kill. We have derelict vessels, which people don't often think about. And then we also have sort of these, what I call pulse inputs from catastrophic events. And those are getting more frequent and increasing in intensity. And so the debris that we're seeing produced from that also contains plastic and enters our waterways. So the thing about plastic, and this was touched upon, is that it doesn't biodegrade. So in terms of it as a source in our environment, something that is a big item ends up just fragmenting into smaller and smaller pieces over time, totally dispersing in our environment. And so I think as I was reflecting on this workshop, I was thinking about the different pieces. So we have the three categories and sort of fitting together in this science aspect, and how do those puzzle pieces fit together? Well, I was thinking in terms of looking at this as risk. Risk to our ocean, risk to marine life, risk to humans. That's a function of hazard and exposure. And so the work that our group is doing and the work that I usually do relates to exposure. So how much plastic is being made, how much of it enters our environment, how much actually gets into our waterways, where does it go, and then what form is it in? Is it in a large piece? Is it in small pieces? And then, of course, the impacts can inform this hazard component of this equation, and that would be toxicology. We've got microbiologists here, ecologists, and then all the way to public health. And so in terms of our category, we're thinking about how can we then reduce this input, how much exposure control would we actually need. So you heard about the estimate of what was going in. I'm going to kind of go through this one example of some science work that we did. This was also in an interdisciplinary working group, and I think there's tremendous value in working interdisciplinary. So I'm glad that I'm here, and I'm glad that I'm different from other folks, and we have this great, rich richness of diversity among our disciplines. So coming up with that number, you heard the 5 to 13 million metric tons of plastic entering the ocean. This was just one source. The source was mismanaged waste. So we looked at 192 countries around the world that have a coastline, and we looked at a 50-kilometer buffer of people that lived 50 kilometers from the coastline, the quantity of waste that they were producing per person, the quantity of this waste that was actually plastic, and then the quantity that was mismanaged, and that was made up of two components. One is inadequately managed waste, which means waste that's not managed in a formal infrastructure, and litter. And then those two components, then we had 3 scenarios of what would actually enter the ocean, and those were from 5 to 13, with our mid-estimate being 8 million metric tons. This is another number that's hard to imagine. So it's equal to about a dump truck of plastic entering the ocean every minute of every year. And as you heard, that was set without any interventions to double by in the next 10 years. So I'm actually going to jump to how this science has been able to sort of inform solutions. So thinking about how we reduce this, and I want to be making the case for developing science, doing the work we're doing here, to then think about how we can influence policy and work towards solutions to global issues like this and others. So if you can imagine, sort of on the way right of your screen, the plastic entering the ocean, if we want that to be a zero input, basically opens up sort of opportunities for interventions and a variety of interventions at all these different points along this value chain of plastic. So the first one, all the way upstream, we talk about the demand for use. And I think those of us that have the luxury to make some of these choices, they may seem small, they may seem mundane, and maybe you're already making those choices, but I just want to reiterate that with population density being the driver that this is, and a time scale, that those choices do matter. Taken collectively and taken over time, those choices matter. But not only your individual choices, but advocating for others and for companies to make the right choices in these regards as well. And then I want to think about, this is the one where I think we can get really creative, thinking about how can we decouple waste generation from economic growth. So we know that's going to happen, and we know that technology has really contributed to us being able to have these collaborative and sharing economies. So this is more of a paradigm shift. So we see bike shares and car shares. You can buy secondhand clothes online. How does that apply to packaging? So if that's the waste that we're trying to produce, we're trying to get people beverages, for example, but how can that happen without packaging? Well, it's certainly possible, again, oftentimes using technology like smartphones, radio frequency identification. You can even have RFID self-serve beer besides all the water. So we're still going to need packaging, though. So thinking about there, for me, working in solid waste management, we don't often control what comes our way. We just have to deal with whatever comes our way and manage it the best that we can. But if we actually had these conversations with our material developers, our product designers, and actually thought about what happens at end of life when we're making products, we can manage them better, and they actually retain their value so that they can be more easily collected. It makes it economical for collection and recycling of those materials. But that involves talking to industry. So in many cases, we need to open up these conversations. We need to have partnerships in responsibility, so talking about shared responsibility of the products and the materials that we're developing. So at the University of Georgia, we're trying to walk this talk through an institute. My colleague, who's a polymer chemist, is the director of this New Materials Institute, but he's working on developing polymers, coatings, and adhesives that are biodegradable, and looking at recycling less valued plastics and various things so that we can sort of use green engineering, move closer to circular materials management through like circular economy principles. And it's an exciting place to be. But my roots are in waste management, and so thinking again, kind of moving down that value chain that I first put up there, that intervention framework, What we found is that much of this mismanaged waste was coming from middle income, rapidly developing countries that need waste management infrastructure. And so in general, we need to collect, capture, and contain this waste. So there's 3 C's there. It's going to look different around the world. In some cases, your barcode reading and RFID technology, and in others, your hand sorting. But it's also very important to think about context and culture. So there's actually 5 C's here. And context and culture are very important when it comes to waste management. There's many intersectional and social issues that go along with this. So whether I'm traveling the world and we're looking at cleaning up some of the top 50 dump sites within the world, trying to elevate the informal waste pickers who can now serve as collectors and help service collection within the community, improve their working conditions, source separating both organics from recyclables to retain the value of those recyclables, and manage 50 to 60% of the waste stream in some of these countries. It becomes very important to work within the community and the local stakeholders to improve their infrastructure. And so then our last chance. Before it gets to the ocean, you have one more chance to capture this material. It might look like an engineered device like Mr. Trash Wheel here who lives in the Baltimore Harbor. There's many other engineered devices that can be used to collect whatever is floating, of course, on top of the water before it gets to the ocean. And then you also need the infrastructure upstream to be able to manage it. And then also our 2 hands. So over 30 years, the International Coastal Cleanup has been happening with the Ocean Conservancy and many, many, many local cleanups. I think California has really been a leader in many of the beach cleanups. But we know that's not the first solution, right? It's way down, but if we do still have this leakage, if we can either get it before it gets to the ocean or sometimes the ocean spits it back out, it's an opportunity to collect it on our coastlines, and it's another opportunity to actually collect data. So this is one way to do that. This is a mobile app we developed, sponsored by NOAA, and it's used to collect data on cleanups all over the world. We have about 1.3 million items. This is opportunistic citizen science data, but it's one way to then have information to then inform, again, upstream solutions locally. Oftentimes, can be used to collect data by citizens about exactly what they're finding, leaking out into their environment locally as well. And so I think collecting this data and using science to inform the solutions is where we're heading and what we want to see happening with science. And lastly, I think understanding that the context that we're working in, whether it be locally or in science, is in these large global initiatives, especially with this issue for sure. There's many intersectional issues, although it fits under SDG, our Sustainable Development Goal 14. It intersects SDG 12 as well. And I just want to recognize all of the global initiatives through the G7 and the G20 who has asked scientists to participate in their creation of their declarations. The newest Save Our Seas Act through the U.S. Congress, the State Department who has participated in sending me to 10 different countries. There's a lot of global initiatives also through National Geographic now on this issue. So thinking about how we are inclusive and fitting together into these initiatives, I think, is very good. And so lastly, whether it be you're a movie star or Prince, some of the amazing kids that I've met around the world, some of the independent waste collectors and informal folks working on this field, or my 10-year-old son, we can all make a difference on this issue. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Professor Jambeck. The third and final topic that we'll be addressing this week is a more positive one, a forward-looking one, a solution-based one, talking about how to curb the flow of plastics into the ocean. There's a lot of novel campaigns developing within the fields of biology and microbiology to leverage the biological power of microorganisms for both plastic creation and for plastic degradation. So here to tell us about the fascinating microbial communities associated with plastic in the sea is Dr. Linda Amaral-Zettler. She's a senior scientist at the NIOZ Royal Netherlands Institute for Sea Research in North Holland. It's a long name. Dr. Amaral-Zettler's research examines the complex microbiomes on plastic debris in the sea, including microbial diversity, distribution, and survival and impact on local and global processes. So let's please welcome Linda.
Thank you, and thanks to the organizers of PAGI for inviting me here to speak to you today. I took the liberty of modifying my title and added the Hitchhiker's Guide bit to the plastosphere. This term, the plastosphere, is one that we originally coined to describe this life that lives on plastic in the ocean, but it's really taken on a completely new dimension, particularly in Wikipedia, that gets edited by various individuals of unknown extraction. And when you do that, some interesting things happen. And the latest definition that I've seen is that it's a term used to refer to ecosystems that have evolved to live in human-made plastic environments. Now, we've already been told that our plastic environment is here to stay, and it's increasing. The first reports of plastic in the ocean were in the early 70s, and as Jenna has informed, and Bryce as well, this increase is going to result in a very large amount of plastic ultimately entering our oceans. And one need not only go very far to see, particularly in the news media outlets, that it's really reached a planetary crisis, one which is deserving of UN consideration. And the images that you typically see when this kind of news comes on board are these sort of macroplastic images, right? But in addition to macroplastic, like plankton itself, microplastics comes in a variety of sizes, and plastic particles in the ocean comes in a variety of sizes, all the way down to the nanoparticles up to huge expandable polystyrene. And so because a lot of this plastic floats, we are able to sort of account for it and count for it. But as you've heard already, there's a bit of plastic that we can't account for. And this has led to this phenomenon of the mystery of the missing plastic out there. And there's even a dramatized version of this that you can go to on YouTube, and that was produced by a French-German documentary company, which I actually think is not a bad treatment of the topic. But really, there are sinks out there that we haven't accounted for, places like the seafloor. So we need to really sort of think about what's happening. And when some of this work was first getting published and getting out there in the literature, there was this obvious question of, well, okay, what about microbes? Is it possible that microbes are helping to solve the problem? And I started becoming involved in this work around 2010 or so, which was a time when there was a marine debris conference that I attended. And we spoke a little bit about some of our work referring to this little micro world that we were seeing on some of these microplastics. And it was translated by the media as to marine microbes digest plastic. The smallest hitchhikers may help us find the disappearing plastic. And despite all good intentions, this really wasn't the message we were trying to convey. And I think it's human nature to really look for solutions maybe before they're quite ripe. We ended up, as science goes, catching up with the media in some cases. 2 years later, publishing our paper that first described this plastosphere. And we were very careful to describe it as a community of microbes that live on this thin layer of life on the ocean that appeared to be degrading the plastic. And what that meant, I think I'll mention in a few slides, is not necessarily a good thing, but again, that's something that we're working on and still trying to sort out. But the original concept behind this plastosphere was that, like the biosphere, which is a thin layer of life that blankets our planet, the plastosphere was the same, but on these tiny pieces of microplastic, which incidentally are defined by the typical size of these pre-production pellets that Jenna showed in her slide. And the reason we likened it to a world is because there are organisms like phototrophs that use light to produce their own energy, predators, symbionts, and even organisms like what we call these pit formers that seem to be actually, eating or at least interacting with the surface of the plastic to help degrade it. Now, the problem of looking at the plastosphere and studying it is quite complex. And the reason for that is because I like to say that every piece of microplastic in the ocean has a different history. And when you're dealing with a tiny piece of plastic, time is a critical element. Not all microplastic ends up in the ocean at the same time, but there's all kinds of basically physical types of forces, chemical forces, and also on top of that, all the biology involved. And when we first started looking at some of these communities, we found that they were incredibly diverse. Each of those different colors represents different bacteria that we find on the surface of microplastic, and they're all very different. So we're here as part of this solutions group to think about the who, where, what, and when of microplastic and how that sort of helps inform interactions of microbes with plastic itself. Now, I want to turn to this topic of degradation versus biodegradation, and I think it's an important topic because it's one where we as human beings on this planet are really trying to look towards microbes for a possible solution. And there are examples of microbes that can, in fact, biodegrade plastics in a certain type of environment, mostly industrial composting environment. And the kinds of plastics that can biodegrade in those particular environments are particularly ones that are produced by microbes themselves, so-called biodegradable and compostable plastics. So when we started seeing these images under the scanning electron microscope of microbes that seem to be embedding themselves in the plastic, we do actually think that this is a form of degradation. But when we think about degradation, it may not necessarily be a good thing. And that's because plastic of different sizes can enter the food web at many different levels. And when it does, it can be ingested and bioaccumulate up to higher trophic levels, such as top predators like sharks, or also the tuna that ends up in our plate. And it is true that right now we don't know whether there are impacts to our health, but I dare say that there also perhaps has not been enough research to really understand what those interactions look like. Now, in addition to degradation, there's also fragmentation that occurs in the marine environment. And but again, the marine environment is not a monolithic sort of bathtub of water. There are different kinds of marine environments, ones that have a lot of UV light subjected to them, and also oxygen and temperature varies in different compartments of the ocean. So something that will degrade that's going to happen at different rates in different parts of the ocean. And I want to emphasize that we tend to think of macroplastic as occupying the largest volume of plastic in the ocean, but when it comes to actual numbers of plastic or concentration of plastic, it's really the micro scale that is accounting for most of what's out there. So when people ask me, do microbes biodegrade plastic in the ocean, it's a really difficult question because we are terrestrial organisms. We tend to think of things in terms of terrestrial systems. And within a terrestrial system, the goal of biodegradability and ultimately compostability is to produce a product that can directly be used, renewed and reused in the environment. The marine environment is more complicated because while there are parallels, there are also really big differences. And when we talk about biodegradation, although it may seem like a semantic thing, it is really important to realize that the ultimate fate of a biodegradable scenario is one that produces CO2 or CO2 and methane that can be directly used by organisms, not something in between. In addition, another challenge that the marine environment presents is that there's fewer microbes typically in marine environments, particularly in the water column, not so much in the sediments, but hydrostatic pressure, cold temperatures, and sparse nutrients all make for comparatively more challenging places for microbes to sort of do their biodegradation activities. And the reason I bring this up is because there's a lot of confusion, there's a lot of misrepresentation, even within the peer-reviewed literature. These are examples of peer-reviewed journal articles where biodegradation is used, where really these stories are about degradation and maybe assimilation, but really not true biodegradation in that the ultimate CO2 evolution is achieved in these kinds of studies. So beyond microbes, where else can we find solutions? Well, the water wheel, trash wheel, has already been introduced by Dr. Jambak. And this is a brainchild of John Kellett, who is trying to clean up Baltimore Harbor. And as with the Ocean Conservancy and ocean cleanups, there is a role for this kind of activity, I think, in places like rivers, where we see tremendous amounts of macroplastic out there, and perhaps this is an urban solution. But there are other parts of the ocean, like these gyres that have already been introduced as well, where we find accumulations of plastic. And, but the kind of plastic that's out there is not there equally, and it concentrates in the gyres. So I think people are aware that there's a solution that's been proposed to deal with this open ocean plastic, and this is Boyan Slot, who actually comes from my new home in the Netherlands, and is right now launching this campaign to try to collect plastic that's out in these gyres that I just showed you. But I think one of the big differences between what we find in the coastal environment and what's really out there in the open ocean is that the ocean gyres, while the perception is that there are these, again, floating islands of macroplastic, what you actually see is something like I show you in the right-hand panel, which is so-called soup, the plastic soup, which are these tiny confetti-sized particles that really occupy the majority of that numerically dominate the plastic that's found in the ocean. And just as a personal aside, this is a cruise that we took. We called it the Microplastic Transit Cruise from the Azores to Sicily. And these are the actual samples that we collected. And this just emphasizes the fact that you have some locations, like the Straits of Messina, for example, that really funnel microplastic. But there are other parts of this transect where we collected no plastic or very little plastic. And so plastic is very patchy in the ocean. So we need for our solutions to match the problems that we're trying to address. So another, I think, message is that plastic-eating microbes probably won't solve our ocean debris problem. And I'm actually a firm believer of that, despite my capacity to have faith in the microbes that I work with. I really think that the solution, on the other hand, begins with us. And you happen to be mostly microbe, because you could argue it's your microbes that are really forcing you in some subliminal way to help this problem. But I really mean that in all honesty, is I think we have to change our behavior. We have to think about a solution pyramid that first involves really preventing and reducing the amount of generation of plastic that enters the ocean in the first place, to think about alternatives in addition to collecting litter from the marine environment, and then recycling and finally disposal. This can be reduced to this three-word suggestion of reduce, reuse, and recycle that's already been mentioned. That's my first public service message. There is also bioplastics out there that may provide a solution as well. But I mentioned this issue of misunderstanding or misinterpretation of what biodegradable versus non-biodegradable is. And this graphic is one of my favorite graphics that kind of lays out the distinction between the two. And what's important to keep in mind is that even if you have a bio-based plastic, it doesn't mean that it's automatically biodegradable, okay? And likewise, you could have a bio-based product that is non-biodegradable, particularly in the marine environment. Oops. So that's something to really bear in mind. And in particular, I just want to emphasize that even if you have a biodegradable plastic, it's not necessarily biodegradable in the marine environment. In fact, most biodegradable plastics are really intended for industrial composting, which requires infrastructure that very few places in the US can accommodate. My second public service message is that beware of greenwashing. A lot of companies want to be green, and while they may be saving the large charismatic fauna out there, the plankton are really in jeopardy because these plastic that's out there is, in many cases, photodegrading, and they're getting into these tiny little pieces that ultimately affect the plankton and may, in fact, be affecting higher organisms as well. So there are different ways of fighting plastic pollution, and one that I am actively engaging in is looking at standards that are being developed in the scientific community to deal with biodegradation tests and various other forms of testing products and their direct impacts on the environment. And one of these, the ASTM 6691, is one that's specifically dealing with the marine environment. And in this case, it looks at CO2 evolution. And one of the few reliable marine biodegradable polymers is something called polyhydroxyalkanoate, which is produced by microbes. And so it's one that naturally can biodegrade in the environment, and that's a good thing. So my second public message is, now I live in the Netherlands now, so I make a habit of standing on the shoulders of giants. I'm not a person of high stature, but while we're standing on the shoulders of giants, don't forget to think small. And this is actually, for those of you who've never been to Woods Hole, a real-life statue of Rachel Carson. And one of the things that she said is that man's attitude towards nature is critically important simply because we have now acquired a fateful power to alter and destroy nature. So while we think about what's out there in the ocean, don't forget the little things because they matter. And finally, my final public service message is that it's really time to start thinking about the ocean because plastic even ends up there, despite the New York Times cartoon otherwise. It really is not a laughing matter, and that we do have to think about it, if not for ourselves, for the next generation that will carry on and inherit our legacy and our passion for plastic. So I'll leave you now with a bit of an art piece that was actually an inspiration, an artist's inspiration. Pinar Yildiz will be speaking at tomorrow's public session, her perception of the plastosphere. And with that, I just want to thank funders that have helped my science and have also helped the facility that we've been able to look at the plastosphere using, and just my contact information. I welcome any feedback or questions you might have in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Linda. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of our plenary speakers. Let's give them a round of applause, please.